So, last system before we move into exam number 2. You guys excited? What do we say is happening this weekend? Nothing except studying. That's right. Nothing but studying. So,
work and we kind of call off.
yeah, don't you got sick days and stuff? Yeah, that's right. Make flashcards, put them in your back pocket. Flashcards are helpful. To be sure, you can make up flashcards for different brain areas and what they do. Today, you can make up flashcards for different hormones and where they come from and what they do. You can make flashcards for the different molecules and ions involved in the whole muscle contraction sliding filament thing and what they do. Those would be good. Have those at your ready, so you're waiting in line at Starbucks and stuff like that. Flip through a couple of those. Talk to people about them. Sound all smart using your big words. Could be good. Okay, so as we mentioned, we've got on Tuesday, second lecture exam. So this one's covering muscular system, nervous system, special senses, and endocrine system. Okay? So compared to the first exam, certainly we're going to have, like usual, a lot of information, but now we've got more systems where we're actually looking at, like we said, like the physiology, about how the parts that we're learning actually work together. So, whether or not that would be more difficult for you, some people like the idea of, okay, it's one thing to memorize parts, but it really helps me to understand if I can, really talk about and think about what they do. On the other hand, like when we were first starting out, we were just doing terminology and all that stuff was new. Now you're a little bit more familiar with it. So just make sure as you're going through, it's not just about parts. It's not just about the lab stuff like we've been seeing, where it's like, what's this and what's that and what's that, right? We're not going to have, on the lecture exam, we're not going to have the muscle man figure and name this muscle and name this muscle and tell me what it does. We've already asked you those types of questions, right? So on the lecture exam, more about how these systems do their job overall, a little bit more about physiology. To be sure, you'll have anatomy stuff in there, asking about components of it and what particular, is this part of this system or what does it do for the system, etc. But we usually have like a little bit of a different focus than what we see with the lab quizzes. The lab quizzes are big stuff. Oftentimes we get into smaller stuff in lecture. Okay, so you'll need the Scantron as well, like last time. I'll be giving you the lecture exam when you come in. In this lecture exam, it's going to be a mix of multiple guess questions as well as short answer questions. No? It should be okay, right? So the short answer questions, like we said, those are going to be the ones where you can describe what you know about that particular topic. So everything that you know, you're going to be putting it down there. Now to be sure, if you forget to add something, like you're talking about, the sliding filament mechanism, and you don't mention calcium at all, well, I'm going to have to dig you for that. But for everything else that you mentioned that's right, you're going to get points for that, right? So it gives you the possibility of getting as many points as possible on that particular question. Typical questions are about 5 points per question. Usually they're about a third of a page or something like that, so you got about that much room. You're not expecting a lot more than that. And you don't have to worry about putting in an essay form or anything like that. If it asks you to, name 4 parts of the brain and describe what they do, there's a part, that's what it does. There's a part, that's what it does. Just a dash between them. It's totally fine. Okay? So it's not English class. You have to use English to describe your particular answer, but I'm not going to worry about punctuation and capitalizing things like that. Spelling counts a bit. I got to be able to tell what you're saying, so you can just put random letters together. But if there's a couple letters off and I understand what you're saying, that's the more important thing. Okay? Okay, so I think off the top of my head it's probably 35 multiple choice questions, so that means 70 points of multiple choice, and then 30 points of these short answer questions. Okay, so it's still mostly multiple choice. There may even be some true-false ones thrown in there as well. So it'll be a good mix of questions, hopefully. Intended to be a good mix of questions. How about that? All right, so like we said, our last system that will be included on that exam is endocrine system. And this one we're going to do the very abbreviated version of it. Okay, so we're just going to hit the high points of it. And with this system, what we find is that this system, in a way, is similar to the nervous system. So it's one of the systems in the body that kind of controls and coordinates the other systems. Now, whereas we learned in the nervous system, it's more like a wired system, right? You have a direct path, or a wire, or a neuron, going from the brain and the spinal cord to that particular muscle or to that particular gland and stimulating it in order to get it to respond, right? So you're going to have a neuron, right? A neuron, which is an individual. What's a neuron? Is it the same as a nerve or no? It's a nerve cell, exactly. So a nerve is an actual bundle of nerve cells or a bundle of axons that are going down to the same particular area, like lateral side of the hand or something like that. So we've got a nerve that's bundling all those together. Once those nerve cells, those neurons get down to their particular area, then they're going to communicate with the muscles or glands that they're controlling. Now, getting that signal down, it was all about that whole leaping electrochemical wave, right? The whole action potential thing with the sodium and potassium and all that. Once we get down to the muscle, though, now we've got a gap, right? We've got a gap at this junction that we call a synapse. So the synapse is where the neuron comes down, and now your muscle cell is there, and you have this physical space between them. So that whole electrochemical wave can't directly pass right into that cell, or that space. So at that point, we have to rely on a chemical. Generically, we call it a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical messenger that's going to communicate between this neuron and the effector cell. Okay? So we're going to release the neurotransmitter, right? The action potential comes down, these calcium channels open up, calcium floods into the cell, and it causes these bags or vesicles of neurotransmitter to dump into the space, into the synaptic cleft. Those diffuse across the gap, bind with receptors on that target cell, and now that target cell has gotten the message. We've communicated across, much like we said, like writing it on a note and throwing it across the room. Okay? So, nervous system, we've got this direct path that gets to the effector cell, and then we do have chemical messengers that are going to finally get that message to the cell to tell it what to do. Endocrine system is a little bit different. Rather than being a wired system, it's going to be wireless. So you're not going to see, there's no like central endocrine organ, and then you see these wires coming out of it connecting like a network over to all these different organs. It's going to use the cardiovascular system to allow its chemical messengers to get where they need to go. So it still uses a chemical messenger, but you may have an endocrine gland that's in the brain, and it releases a chemical messenger called a hormone. It dumps that hormone into the bloodstream, and then it's all about going through all those blood vessels, etc., and sometime arriving at a target cell. Okay? So again, it's a wireless system. It's still coordinating and controlling different organs and telling them what to do when, but it's doing so through the cardiovascular system. So it's a little bit less precise. We don't just go bzzz and tell this muscle to twitch. You release it into the bloodstream, and now it's circulating around, and at some time it'll end up maybe at that muscle or at the heart or something like that. A receptor will bind it, and they'll get the message. So it tends to be a little bit slower. It tends to be a little bit more kind of longer-term effects because all those hormones are circulating around the bloodstream for a while. You can't just like clear them out in a second like you can with a neuron going bzz, bzz. You can start and stop that. Once you release those hormones into the cardiovascular system, it's going to be floating there for a while. So for instance, if you were driving to campus and somebody starts to come into your lane or something like that, and you start to, then you get back on, you have that kind of adrenaline rush going on, right? You're all hyped up and your heart rate's going for a while, and it takes a little while for you to kind of simmer down from that. That's because epinephrine and norepinephrine, these hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline, are going around your system. They are active for a little while as well. So everything takes a while to kind of calm down as those hormones go away. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of endocrine system. It's similar to the nervous system in terms of its overall function, but it does it a little bit differently. It does it with hormones instead. Okay? Now, when we talk about endocrine system, the organs that are going to release hormones, those are actually glands. Now, previously we talked about glands when we were talking all kinds of different systems. So, for instance, in the skin, we saw lots of glands in the skin. So what's a gland that we saw in the skin? Sweat gland, yeah. What else?
Spacious.
Yeah, sebaceous gland, right? The oil gland that's actually putting oil onto the hair, follicle, etc. So those are some glands, and those are examples of what are called exocrine glands. And with those glands, they produce some sort of secretion in that little ball of cells, and then they dump it into a little duct, and that then conducts it to the local area, like the sebaceous gland right onto the skin, the sweat gland on the skin, etc. Or even a salivary gland, like going into your mouth. Those are different types of exocrine glands. They use a duct to transport it to an area nearby. So the other type of gland that's relevant to this system is going to be the endocrine gland. So again, it's still a gland that produces a secretion, but instead of sweat or oil or something like that, it's putting out hormones. And instead of putting it into a duct or a little tube for the local area, it's dumping it into the cardiovascular system for long-term transport. So again, that way, even if we have an endocrine gland that's in the brain, it can have a target organ, something that it's controlling that can be half a body length away, and it uses the cardiovascular system to transport it. Okay? And in fact, today, as we go through some of these different endocrine glands, we'll find that in some cases, you'll have an endocrine gland that also counts as an exocrine gland. So for instance, the pancreas, anybody know the pancreas? What system does that belong to, do you think? Digestive system, very good. So most of the pancreas is a feather-shaped organ that sits deep to the stomach. And if we, like I said, if we kind of organize sometime, you guys want to go down to the lab and see the cadaver and stuff like that, you can actually see where the pancreas sits deep to the stomach like that. You actually have to lift up the stomach, and you'll see it cutting across there. What it does for most of the organ is it puts out a bunch of digestive enzymes, dumps them into the small intestine, mixes with the food, and helps to break them down, kind of cut those large molecules into smaller and smaller ones. Okay? But in very distinct little areas in the pancreas, it also has cells that are endocrine in function, hormones that are coming from those cells, particularly insulin and glucagon. And a lot of people have heard of insulin. What does insulin do? Yeah, exactly. So it helps our sugar levels in the body, particularly in the blood, so we can make sure that we have not too much and not too little, just the right amount of sugar, glucose, floating around the blood. Because a long time ago, when we were learning about production of ATP and stuff like that, that glucose molecule is the beginning molecule that we use to fuel the production of ATP, the whole mitochondria and stuff like that. So we got to make sure that we always have enough. And so these hormones are always kind of tweaking that, making sure it's not too high, too low. And it comes from the pancreas. So the pancreas actually counts double, both exocrine and endocrine. So technically it's part of two systems. Okay, so like we said, this system, its main role is to secrete these chemical messengers that are called hormones. Okay? And the hormones are going to control and coordinate what we call metabolic processes. Basically, the cellular activities in a bunch of different organs. And like we said, it's not going to be as precise as the nervous system, but it's going to help to control, like sometimes if there's changes in the body that are occurring, like different growth stages or something like that, or there's transitions even in daily cycles or something, those types of things. It's not going to be like precise where we can just turn it on and off. It's going to be a little bit more subtle than that. Okay? Now, their actions, while they tend to last a little bit longer, they're still going to be considered precise. And that's because the cells that have the right receptor types on their surface are going to be the only ones that will be able to get that message. Because if you think about it, right, if you dump whatever, insulin or epinephrine into the bloodstream, it's going anywhere, right? It's going to your foot, it's going to your pancreas, it's going up to your brain and stuff like that. How come every cell in the body doesn't just light up with activity as soon as that hormone gets released? Well, it's the fact that only certain cells in certain organs will have the right receptor to be able to bind that hormone. If you don't got the right receptor, it's like a lock and key. If you don't got the right key, that lock's not going to open. So if you don't have the right receptor on your cell surface, then that message is going to go by, it's not going to have any effect. Okay? So even though it's kind of an imprecise delivery service going everywhere, there's only certain cells that are going to be able to hear that message. Okay, so what we'll find today as we do our tour is we're going to go through a number of different very important endocrine glands in different areas of the body, talk about the hormones they put out and their particular effects. That's going to be most of what we talk about today. It's just looking at examples of endocrine glands and the hormones that work to control our body processes. Okay? And like I said, in terms of flashcards and things like that, that's a lot of the information of this chapter, and it really breaks down the kind of flashcard-like level. You write the name of the hormone on the front, on the back you write where it comes from, the gland it comes from, and what it does. And then you have, with that stack of whatever, 15 or 20 cards, you've got most of the information that you need from this chapter. Okay? Okay, but before we get to that, we're going to talk a little bit about a couple things. Number one, how do these endocrine glands make these different hormones? How do they synthesize them inside of these cells? And then number two, what kind of controls the release of these hormones? How does an endocrine gland know when it's time to release epinephrine or insulin or something like that? Okay? All right, so the first topic is how these different cells make these hormones. So there's two different chemical classes of hormones. The first group are called steroid hormones. Now, when people hear that, they're always thinking of major sports figures and things like that. Oh, right, this guy's on steroids or whatever. And so you're looking at that and you're like, oh, I didn't understand that that's a naturally occurring thing. Or, for the most part, when people hear that, they think, oh, well, steroids, i.e., that's the same as testosterone, right? You're not talking about a bunch of a Major League Baseball player and he's injecting estrogen. You're not thinking that when they say steroids, are you? Right? But technically, steroid hormones that are made naturally in the body, the reason we call them steroid hormones is that it's a hormone that's based on the cholesterol molecule. So any hormone that's made with cholesterol as the base model for it counts as a steroid hormone. And certainly that includes testosterone, but it also includes progesterone and estrogen and another one from the adrenal gland called aldosterone and things like that, and cortisol, which is like corticosterone. Any of those that kind of have the "-one" on the end you sometimes hear about, those are all steroid hormones. They're made from cholesterol. We just tack different things onto it chemically, and now it's testosterone, and now it's cortisol and stuff like that. Okay? So, number one, steroid hormones aren't bad. You use them every single day. Number two, steroid hormone doesn't just mean testosterone. It's a whole category of hormones that are made from cholesterol. Okay? So cholesterol is actually a lipid, right? Now remember that our cells, when we talk about cells, they're all surrounded by a lipid bilayer. So when this particular type of hormone goes through and gets to the target cell, it can actually slip right through that lipid bilayer easily because they're made from similar materials, right? Like and like get together, okay? So that is a little bit different than what we'll find a little bit later on for our water-based hormones instead.
So that's what's meant by lipid soluble?
So lipid soluble. So lipid soluble means that any type of lipid molecule, whether it's a fat or an oil or cholesterol or something like that, that means that if you take them and you put them together, it's kind of like oil and vinegar dressing, right? The oil, all the different oily parts will stay together and get together chemically. They'll work with each other. But if you have something that is water-based, they're not going to get along. Yeah, they're going to separate. So with that lipid bilayer is supposed to separate things that are hydrophilic, things that are water-loving,
right,
and it's restricting them from getting inside the cell. But if you have something that is fat-loving, that's lipid-soluble, it will slip right through. So it's almost like, you have guards that are like, oh, you're one of us, you can come through no problem. Like that. Okay? So, for these hormones, when they get to the target cell, we said they have to bind with a receptor. Turns out that with cells that are binding steroid hormones, the receptor is actually inside of the nucleus. It slips right into that cell, it actually gets inside the nucleus, and the receptor is located inside of the nucleus. So it really gets in there in the nucleus. Now what's the nucleus doing? Why is the nucleus going to be important? So that's where the DNA is, and the DNA has two major functions like we talked about. Number one, it's how we know how to make new cells like the first one. Number two, it's a whole cookbook on how to make all the different proteins that the cell is going to use for itself or export, etc. Okay? So all those little recipes are called genes. And so these hormones, in essence, will have an effect down inside of the cell, and they will affect, like if this cell is going to put out its own hormone or put out enzymes or something like that, this hormone getting to that cell is going to tell it when to do that and what to put out. Okay? So it's going to the nucleus, it's going to where the blueprint or the recipe book is, and then telling it what that cell should do. So these are for the steroid hormone. For the non-steroid hormone, this is the second major class, these are basically made kind of off of proteins or amino acids instead. And protein-based hormones tend to get along with water, so they are what are called water-soluble. So when they're transporting in the blood, they actually get along pretty well because the main fluid component of the blood, you guys know what it's called? Plasma, right? It's what you guys are selling right now to buy your books and stuff like that, right? So the plasma there is mostly water. And so if you have a water-soluble hormone that's in the blood, it's all happy as a clam because it likes water. Now when it gets to the cell, though, it gets to that lipid bilayer, and that lipid bilayer won't let it through. And so for a water-soluble hormone, these protein-based hormones, the receptor, in order to get that message through, has to be right there at the edge because it can't get any further. So it's like if you're, trying to get into a club or something like that, you're like, oh no, my friend's in the club, I just got to talk to him and stuff like that, let me in. They're like, nope, you can't get in, right? It bounces right there. He's like, okay, if you tell me your message, I'll tell your friend whatever you got to tell him. That's what it's like for a water-soluble hormone. The receptor's right on the surface because that hormone can't get inside the cell to have an effect. So it binds to a receptor on the surface, and then that message is going to be relayed through, and you'll see that coming up. Okay? So they bind with receptors at the target cell membrane, and they rely on something that are called second messenger systems to get that signal further into the cell. A bit like that bouncer actually going inside and relaying the message for that person on the outside. Okay? So that's what we see here. Here's the first example. Here's our steroid hormone. And this right there, see that 4-carbon ring structure right there? That's basically what cholesterol looks like in terms of a molecule. And again, it depends on what we have attached to the outside of it as to what type of steroid hormone it's going to be. But that steroid hormone will slip right through the cell membrane, slip right into the nucleus, and here's the receptor right inside the nucleus. So it's going to affect the expression of a particular gene, and then the mRNA is going to read it, and we're going to produce a particular protein as a response. That's how the cell is going to say, okay, I got the message, you want me to make this, and I'm going to make it, and I'm going to release it from the cell or whatever. Okay? So that's for steroid hormones. For our non-steroid hormones, like you see here, it can't get through that lipid bilayer. So there's the receptor right there that it's going to bind to. And once it binds there, you see these arrows going back and forth like this? This is like the domino system of chemicals that's basically relaying that message until we get deep enough inside the cell where we can see a similar type of response, where the cell is going to respond and produce something or become more active or whatever. Okay? So non-steroid or water-soluble hormones have to bind to a receptor at the surface of the cell. Then we have this whole second messenger system which finally gets the message inside of the cell where we see it respond. Okay? Okay. So that gets us through that little first topic of, okay, we have these hormones. What type of hormones, how do they exert their effects? So we have 2 classes of hormones. Steroid, which are lipid-soluble ones, and then we have the non-lipid soluble or the water-soluble protein-based ones instead. Okay? Second topic in this chapter is, how does an endocrine gland know when to secrete its hormone, whether it's a steroid one or a protein-based one? How does it know? How come it's not just pumping it out overall? What do you think? How could it actually tell? If there's got to be some need in the body, how is that endocrine gland going to know when to become active? Cardiovascular system, so maybe like the cardiovascular system, like the heart rate is increasing or something like that, and it's like showing more blood flow throughout, and now those active cells are showing more activity. Maybe there's a response there. That's possible, right? And the hormones, maybe. Okay. So the thyroid is one of our different glands that we're going to be going through. It produces hormones, and so maybe the thyroid is what? What could be a signal for the thyroid? Like the thyroid is signaling something else, maybe?
I think that signals how you produce it. I don't know what tells it.
Yeah, so that's actually gets into it a little bit. So what we find is for a particular endocrine gland, we'll find that one type of control is you'll have an endocrine gland here that actually sends a hormone down to another endocrine gland to tell it when to release its hormones. So for the thyroid gland, you've got a pituitary gland up here that releases a specific hormone for the thyroid, which tells the thyroid when to release its hormones. Okay? So that's certainly one type of control mechanism too. There's really 3 of them overall. Okay? So you can see that what they're called is hormonal control, nervous control, and humoral control. So hormonal control is what we just talked about, where you have one endocrine gland that's like the manager. This whole system is like a management system. It's like administration, right? So if you think about your job and stuff like that, you've got the person that's right above you, which is like the shift manager or something like that. They're in charge when you're there in that particular time period. But then there's probably like an assistant manager that handles scheduling and stuff like that. Up above that, there's a whole store manager that handles everything in terms of finances and hiring and stuff like that. And then maybe there's a district manager, etc., right? If anything happens on those upper levels and they make a decision about how the store is going to run, it's going to trickle down to you and your activity patterns are going to change, right? They're going to decide, oh, we only have one person working at a time, you've got to handle everything, right? Whoever decided that on any level up above you, you're going to have to change what you do in order to accommodate that. So hormonal changes is where, like you said, you've got one endocrine gland up here, that signals this one down here, that then releases a hormone that controls, who knows, like you said, like metabolism or blood sugar or something like that down below. Okay? So that is a type of control. It's hormonal control. You have one gland talking to the next one, telling it when to release its hormone. The next one is called nervous control. And that one makes sense. We said we have two control systems in the body. Endocrine, which is telling everybody what to do, and then there's nervous, right? Just like telling the muscle when to contract. If you have a neuron that goes bzz, 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 that tells it when to put out a particular hormone. So we do have some endocrine glands that have a neuron coming from the central nervous system, which stimulate it and tell it when to release. Okay? Third major type of control is called humoral. So for that one, if you do a lot of laughing or something like that, the release increases, and if you're crying, it decreases. No. Maybe that has to do with different types of female hormones, different times of month, I don't know. But, no, Tom's like, I don't get that, I don't write that on the exam. Okay, no, humoral has to do with fluids, okay? So if you remember from the eye, maybe this weekend when you're studying the eye, because you have a special senses quiz this weekend or something like that, right? So in the eye, we have a couple different fluids. We have aqueous humor, which is a fluid that's in the anterior part of the eye, just underneath the cornea. We have vitreous humor, which is a gel-like fluid, which is way back in the main cavity of the eye, right next to the retina and stuff like that. Aqueous and vitreous humor, those are both referring to the fact that those are fluids. When you say the word humor in terms of anatomical speak, it has to do with fluids. So when we say humoral control, what that means is we've got an endocrine gland that actually has like chemoreceptors associated with it, where it can monitor what's going on in a particular fluid. So it can monitor it for calcium levels and see if they're too high or too low. It can monitor it for sugar levels and see if they're too high or too low. So it's actually, much like the homeostatic feedback loops we keep talking about, it's got a receptor and it's actually directly testing it. It's not waiting for any manager to tell it what to do. It's actually aware, if you will, and looking at those fluids and seeing, oh, it's getting too high, I got to release this hormone and tamp it back down again. Okay? So that's the third level of control. It's called humoral instead. And this graphic here shows those types of examples. So here is the thyroid gland, and on the back side of it we have the parathyroid glands, these little spheres on the back side. Okay? These organs, one of their roles for those endocrine glands are to control calcium levels in the blood. Calcium, is important for muscle contraction, for nervous system in terms of releasing neurotransmitter and stuff like that. So it's important that we have enough. And those organs will monitor the blood levels of calcium, make sure they're not getting too high and too low. If they do, time to release the hormone to control that. Okay? Middle one here is an example of neurocontrol. So what you can see is we have neurons that go right down into the center of a gland. This is called the adrenal gland. It sits on top of each of the kidneys. Inside of it, we actually have an area that's called the medulla on the inside and a cortex on the outside. The inside has those neurons going directly into it, and when we need to release things like epinephrine, etc., there's going to be a sympathetic neuron that goes bzzz and tells it to release it, and it puts it out into the blood. Okay, so that's neural control. The last one is hormonal control. That one, like we said, we have this one here, pituitary gland, sometimes called the master gland, because a lot of its hormones go down and tell other endocrine glands what to do, kind of like the store manager talking to the other managers. Okay? So the pituitary gland will release hormones into the blood, and they will arrive at all these other endocrine glands and stimulate them to release their own hormones. Okay? So it's like we said, it's like a management process. So that's hormonal control right there. Okay? So 3 different ways that an endocrine gland knows when to release its hormones. All right. So that takes us over to here where, like I said, in these different homeostatic systems, we need to be able to monitor what's going on, and if the level of a particular factor, like glucose or calcium or something like that, gets off, we want to be able to know that and then make changes to fix it, okay? So when you look at this graph right here, this could be a graph of the temperature in your house, as well as the concentration of a particular hormone in your body. You have a set point that you see right there as that flat line, and so the set point might be like 78 degrees in your house or something like that. But if you actually measure the temperature in your house, it would actually go up a little bit and go down a little bit and up a little bit and down a little bit, right? Because it's got to get down to like 77 degrees before the air conditioner or the heater kicks on and then brings it up, or the air conditioner kicks on and brings it down. So it's going to vary on a day-to-day or even month-to-month or an hour-to-hour basis, okay? And it's the same thing in terms of hormones and the things that they control. They're going to vary a little bit. But we're going to try to maintain it on average around that set point. Okay, so that takes us to the last section, which ends up being the bulk of the chapter, and that is, what are the different endocrine glands and the hormones that they put out? And when you look at this map here, you can see how the endocrine glands are like all over the body. So it's a darn good thing that we have this cardiovascular system that can distribute their hormones wherever they need to go, because if I got a thyroid gland in my neck and I need to stimulate another cell that's down my thigh, well, that's a pretty far distance to go. So luckily we've got blood vessels that can kind of bridge that gap for us. Okay, so what we're going to do is, like I said, just a little bit of a tour, highlighting the major organs like you saw in that graphic, and then talk about the hormones they put out and what they do. Okay? So the first one that we start with is this big master gland, the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland actually hangs off of the inferior surface of the brain. So if we look at the graphic, remember here's our brain, and you should know different parts of the brain, right? What's this big wrinkly area right there called? Cerebrum, yeah. What's this little walnut-shaped structure back here called? Cerebellum, right? And how about this little anterior bulge right here on the brainstem? Yeah? Pons, so P-O-N-S, right? So that's the pons right there. Medulla oblongata right there underneath it. Okay? In the center of the brain, we have that thing that's called the diencephalon with the thalamus, the relay center. The router is going to be located in the hypothalamus. Hanging off of the hypothalamus right there is the pituitary gland. Okay? So the pituitary gland is actually part of the brain, but it is going to release hormones that actually control a lot of these other glands and tell them what to do. Okay? Even all the way down to the reproductive structures as well. Okay? So the pituitary gland itself separates into two different lobes. So if you look at it very closely, it's just a small kind of gland like this, but it subdivides into an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. Okay? So there's two lobes to it. And each of the different sides of it, the front half and the back half, release different hormones. So we're going to start out with the anterior part, the front part. We're going to talk about the hormones that come out. And not only is the pituitary gland known as the master gland because it controls a lot of other glands, but it ends up putting out a lot of different hormones too. Obviously, it's much easier if we have just like one gland putting out one hormone, but this one, like we said, is a master gland, so it puts out a lot. So the first one that we talk about that the anterior pituitary puts out is one that's called growth hormone. Okay? So growth hormone, it's pretty straightforward, if you will, if you look at the name, right? It stimulates growth or increase in metabolic activity in a lot of different cells. In fact, wherever we can, if it's specific enough where we can describe the function of a hormone and just say this is the one cell that responds to it, we will. But this one with growth hormone, there are so many cells around the body, whether it's bone cells or muscle cells or glandular cells or something like that. There's so many cells around the body that respond to growth hormone that we basically just say stimulates body cells to grow and reproduce. Reproduce like mitosis and things like that. Reproduce, if you talk about like when you're growing from a baby to a toddler, that's a major growth period where your muscles and tendons and ligaments and bones and all kinds of structures are going to have to get bigger. That is the hormone that actually stimulates all those different tissues to do that. But even you'll see growth hormone changes that occur even during periods when you don't think about growth. So for instance, if you are going to the gym or something like that, when you go to the gym and you're lifting weights and you're thinking about your muscles getting bigger, that's also under the influence of growth hormone. It will actually, there's a response system where the muscles say, oh, I'm kind of, I got these little tears in me and stuff like that. I'm kind of strained because I was lifting all these heavy things for a while. And your body goes, well, I seem to be lifting heavy things on a regular basis now, so we better respond and try to make these muscles bigger, because apparently that's what we're going to do now. We're going to lift heavy things as part of our day-to-day activity, right? So it's going to respond and trying to make those muscles bigger so that they can lift more force. And it's that pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, that's going to continually then signal those muscles to enlarge, to kind of build up their size of their cells and things like that. Okay, so growth hormone has a lot of different functions around the body, both mainly in terms of, like I said, growth and reproduction. It also influences what we call metabolism. And that is, in essence, kind of how quickly our cells will burn through the energy that they need and do the activities that they're going to do. If you talk about somebody who has like a low metabolism, right? Low metabolism, they can be kind of lethargic or something like that, or they can, when they take in a lot of nutrients, they end up like storing on them a lot because their cells aren't burning through them, right? Somebody with a high metabolism, their cells are going like little engines all the time, so when you give them energy, they just burn right through it instead, okay? But growth hormone helps to regulate overall metabolism, okay? So that's one. Two is a hormone that's called prolactin. And if you look at that one, right, break it down between the prefix and the suffix there, that basically says, go milk. That's the function, okay? So it stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. Now, if we look at that, that also gives you the idea that not all these hormones are going to be active all the time. Not all these hormones are going to be active in every individual, right? You're not going to see, hopefully, a lot of prolactin in males unless you go to like Amsterdam or something like that, right? So that is a hormone that's going to be more specific to females and only at certain times in her life as well, okay? So prolactin, though, is two of the different hormones that we come out of the pituitary gland. Third one, thyroid stimulating hormone. I wonder what that one does, right? If you're listing some hormones, you want an easy one, go for that one. Thyroid stimulating hormone, that's the name. It stimulates the thyroid, like you were talking about, to release its hormones. So it's a management type of hormone, okay? Okay, this one, it looks like it's more complicated because it's a longer word, but it's not. If we look at that word, adrenocorticotropic hormone, okay? The tropic part just means that it's a controlling hormone that stimulates another endocrine gland. When we look at the beginning of the word, though, the adrenal part is adrenal gland, which is another endocrine gland. The cortical part refers to the cortex, or the outer layer of the adrenal gland. So this hormone has a job of going down to the adrenal cortex and telling the cortex to release its hormones. That's it. So it's a bit like thyroid stimulating hormone, just with a longer name and a different gland. Okay, so this technically is 5 and 6 here. There's 2 hormones here that are related to reproductive function. That's not me. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Those 2 hormones are what are called gonadotropins. And again, when we see tropic or tropin or something like that, it refers to the fact that it is a hormone that goes down and stimulates another endocrine gland. So these 2 hormones are going to go down and stimulate the ovaries and the testes to release their hormones, like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. That's it. Same as like thyroid stimulating hormone, etc. Now those 2 hormones, obviously they have different names. There's 2 different hormones, so they're going to be slightly different in function. But we'll talk about their specific functions at the end of the semester when we get to reproductive system. Right now, we'll say that those are 2 tropic hormones that go down and stimulate the gonads to release their hormones. That's it. Okay? So not too bad. So there's 6 different hormones that we saw coming from the anterior pituitary. That's the front part. The back part's a little bit easier. Okay? This is posterior pituitary. It puts out 2 hormones. The first one is called antidiuretic hormone. So, if we just stop for a minute and think about that one, what's a diuretic? Something that makes you pee, right? So a diuretic can be things like alcohol, caffeine, etc. So when you take those in, the chemicals that are in there, like caffeine and the alcohol in there, will actually make you pee more than the amount of fluid that you're taking in. So normally if you take in a fluid, it's a whole balance thing. Take in fluid, put out fluid, right? The more you take in, the more you put out. You're not putting enough in, you're not going to get much out, etc. But for diuretics, those chemicals can influence your kidneys to actually release more fluid than you're taking in, which is why, not this weekend because you're studying this weekend, but on a different weekend, if you're drinking things, we'll think that you're drinking caffeine, right? So if you're drinking a lot of caffeine or something like that, you can actually get dehydrated. And you're like, I don't get it. I was drinking all weekend long and somehow I'm dehydrated, right? Because even though you have input, you've got more output because of these diuretics. All right, so let's look at this title then. Anti-diuretic hormone. So what does that mean then? Keeps you from peeing, exactly. So we translate that to no pee hormone. Now obviously it's not going to lock down your bladder, but if you're dehydrated because of this heavy weekend, not this weekend, next weekend maybe, okay? If you are dehydrated, your body needs to respond and say, oh, I need to hold on to fluids, right? So I want to reduce the amount that I'm losing. And so anti-diuretic hormone is going to cause the kidneys to hold on to water, which is going to better your situation in terms of dehydration, okay? So that's what that one does. It goes down and stimulates the kidneys, tells them to hold on to water. That means you're not going to be letting go as much. Okay, last one from the posterior pituitary is called oxytocin, okay? And oxytocin, this one's an interesting one. The main function of it is going to be in the female reproductive system. Its main function is to go down and stimulate the uterine walls with its smooth muscle to contract. Okay? So you can imagine, when is it going to be important for a uterine wall to contract, right? Childbirth. It also happens on a monthly cycle and a menstruation cycle when you're shedding the endometrium, the inner uterine lining. That muscular contraction helps that to separate, etc. But of course, during childbirth, for sure, there's a lot of contractions going on there. This hormone is actually one of the few examples in the body of what we call positive feedback. We're always looking at this thing like negative feedback. Like, here's a set point, it starts changing, and we nudge it back. It starts changing this way, and we nudge it back. Any change, we have a negative response. We push it back to where it was. Positive feedback, if it starts changing, then you keep pushing it, and it gets further and further away. It's not very good for homeostasis, but it's good for a case when, for 9 months, you've been maintaining 2 individuals, and now you want to shift back to a set point when you're only maintaining 1. Okay? So you're shifting. So with oxytocin, the way it works is when the baby is large enough and positioned down low in the uterus, down towards the cervix, then there's a lot of mechanoreceptors there that are actually going to get stretched, right? A mechanoreceptor, you physically deform them, they send a signal into the brain, okay? So those stretch receptors or mechanoreceptors start going off, signal up to the brain, and the pituitary goes, oh, okay, my response is, here's some oxytocin. So the oxytocin goes down, gets to the uterus, starts telling the uterus to contract. Now with the uterus contracting, if that wall, those mechanoreceptors were stretched already because the baby was there, now they're stretching even more because it's stretching up against the baby, it's contracting on the baby. So now their stretch receptors signal more up to the brain, and the brain's response, oh, you like that? How about some more oxytocin? More contractions, more oxytocin going back up, and it just increases and increases, right? So the contractions get more frequent and stronger until the baby is actually birthed. And then everything kind of resets a bit. Okay? So oxytocin is going to be more focused, obviously, in female function, and again, only at certain times. Okay? Now there are other interesting developments with oxytocin that maybe we'll kind of talk about later, but what they found is some of the research for oxytocin will find that they found that it has behavioral effects as well. So it helps to initiate what's called pair bonding between a parent and the child, so that, to a certain extent, you care about that infant that's crying and pooping and stuff like that, that you actually have a connection with it and care enough about it to take care of it. And so when those oxytocin levels stay high, during, in fact, nursing and stuff like that, it helps to create bonding. And in fact, they found that even with males, that male oxytocin levels will go up during some of these periods, and again, it helps to form this kind of bonding. It has an emotional effect as well. That's something they've only found out within the last 10 years or so. Okay. Only two from the posterior pituitary, so now we're done with the pituitary gland. Like I said, master gland does a lot of controlling of other things, puts out like 8 different hormones, so there's a lot of stuff going on with the pituitary. The other glands are simpler, okay? Thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland that sits in here, right around the thyroid cartilage. So the Adam's apple is the thyroid cartilage. Thyroid gland sits just underneath it here, okay? It puts out 2 different hormones. One of them is very simple, right? Thyroid gland puts out thyroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary tells the thyroid to put out thyroid hormone. It's almost a very basic system here, okay? Its main effects, again, are so varied, they affect so many different cells that in essence we just say it increases metabolism. So there's lots of different cells that will increase their activity when thyroid hormone is circulating around. There are muscle cells and epithelial cells and all kinds of cells that will increase their metabolic activity. Okay, so this helps to maintain, like you said, a basal metabolic rate. Whether it's high or low or whatever, has to do a lot with thyroid gland being secretions going out. And so you hear a lot of people will have thyroid gland issues. And with any of these different endocrine glands, if the secretions are too high or too low, then you start having effects on these target cells, right? So for instance, people that have diabetes, right? That has to do with hormone levels being too high, too low. We'll talk about from the pancreas. But hypo, low secretion, or hyper, high secretion is going to have effects. So if you have somebody who's hypothyroid, their overall metabolic rate is going to slow down. They're not going to, even to the point where they're not going to move as fast, they're going to feel lethargic, they're going to feel cold all the time, they're going to gain weight because their cells aren't burning through the energy and stuff like that. So their normal set point is down lower than where it should be. Hyperthyroid goes the other way. Most people would rather prefer hyperthyroid because then they eat whatever they want and then just burn it off, right? But hyperthyroid, the problem with that is all the cells respond. So the cells get more active, including like neurons and muscle cells, like heart cells and stuff like that. So they usually have increased blood pressure and pulse rate and stuff like that. It's a bit of a stress on their system as well. Okay, so that's thyroid hormone. The other hormone that comes from the thyroid gland is called calcitonin. Again, they're giving you a hint about what it relates to or what it controls. Calcitonin helps to control calcium levels. So that plus there, it's a 2+ ion, okay? But calcium, we said, is very important. Muscle cells, neuron cells, a lot of different cells in the body. And we want to make sure that those levels in the blood are just right. We got a lot of free calcium floating around, but not too much. So if you just ate a big meal where you went to like the melting pot and you had fondue for your whole lunch, and you just load it up on a bunch of cheese, you can imagine that as that gets digested, your calcium levels in your blood shoot up, okay? We don't want things to get too high in the body. We want things nice and controlled. So if it starts going up too high, calcitonin from the thyroid gland is going to be secreted. It's going to tell the osteoblasts, and everyone's like, whoa, osteoblast, it's blast from the past, right? Osteo means bone, blast is building. Osteoblasts take calcium from the blood and knit it into bone and put it in bone for storage, okay? So that calcitonin is what stimulates those osteoblasts to take that calcium, knit it into bone when we need to store it, okay? Also, if the bones need to grow a bit, this is one that's going to help out with that. So if you're going through a growth period or something, or if you're going to the gym, there's a lot of muscular activity on the bones have to respond and actually get stronger as well. So this will help with that. It decreases blood calcium levels, which means that we take it from the blood and we put it into the bones. Okay? Okay, so that's thyroid gland. It's only 2 cells, or 2 hormones. Parathyroid, make that the dot there, it's not necessarily an X. Okay? Parathyroid glands put out parathyroid hormone. Now these are 2 sets, 4 glands overall that are on the posterior side of that butterfly-shaped thyroid gland. Okay? It's a separate gland, but it's just attached to the thyroid. That's why it has the name. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. You guys are like, didn't we just say that calcitonin does something like that? Right?
It decreased.
Exactly, right. So calcitonin brings it down. Parathyroid hormone brings it up. So it's a bit like when we talk about the nervous system, we had sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? Gas pedal and brake. And if we have both of them, we can very, very precisely control exactly where we want it to be. So calcium levels, if they get too low, we've got to make sure that the muscles and the neurons have what they need. Okay? If it gets too low, parathyroid hormone is released into the blood. That tells the osteoclasts, the chewing cells of the bone, chew up the bone and start getting that calcium out into the blood again. And that's going to bring calcium levels up. So what we see is that with parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, they are antagonistic, just like we talked about with muscles, right? An antagonistic muscle, you got one, the prime mover, etc., that performs the action. The antagonistic ones perform the opposite action. Same thing in terms of hormones. You have hormones that work against each other, so we can make sure we're very finely controlling a particular factor, in this case, calcium. Okay?
How often is this hormone being released?
Yeah, good question. So we saw with some of the other hormones, like whatever, oxytocin, comes up, whatever, maybe when you're 30 for a few months or something like that, and then it's going to go down again. Other hormones will kind of go up, like we said, you go to the gym, growth hormone is going to go up during that period, it's going to go down, etc. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin levels are always going to be released a little bit at every time during the day. It all depends on kind of what you're eating and when you're eating, etc. So you'll see activity for these definitely change when you have calcium levels increase or decrease in the body. So when you're eating, these ones are going to have to respond because we're trying to regulate calcium levels. And this is the main way we're going to get calcium. If your cells are using it up, like you're doing a lot of activity, you're going to the gym a lot, stuff like that, there's a lot of calcium that's actually getting used up as well. So we may need more calcium, so we may see them respond then. So anytime there's going to be a flux or a change in calcium levels, these are going to be responding, going, whoa, 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 we want to make sure it's just right. So we need to make sure we go up or down, maintain it about here. So definitely do around meal times and things like that, but almost any time per day, they're just kind of checking and doing the nudging to make sure it's right. Okay, so like you said, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone work opposite to each other, so they're antagonistic, like we said. Antagonistic to each other. Okay, so working our way down to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, we said, are triangular-shaped glands that sit on top of the kidneys. You got two kidneys, so you got two adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands have two regions to them, like you see here. They got an inner core that we call the medulla, and they've got an outer layer that we call the cortex. And those two different areas put out totally different hormones. Okay? Now, there are specific layers to them as well. We won't worry about that. But we do need to know that there's a cortex in the medulla. Because we already saw when we were talking about control of hormone release, the cortex is going to be controlled by the adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary gland, hormonal control. The medulla is going to have neural control going to it instead. Excuse me. Okay, so what's going on in the medulla? Medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, which those translate to adrenaline and noradrenaline. Once upon a time, way back when, 60s or something like that, there was a pharmaceutical company that came out with a drug that had effects similar to adrenaline. And the name of their drug was very similar to adrenaline. And so, in terms of the medical field, they didn't want people mixing up. Oh, they're talking about this drug from this company. Oh, no, we're talking about this natural hormone. So in the United States, they actually changed adrenaline and noradrenaline to epinephrine and norepinephrine. But it's the same thing. If you go to England and you learn about the adrenal medulla, they'll tell you that it's adrenaline and noradrenaline. It's just the same thing. Okay. So most of us know what adrenaline and, in essence, noradrenaline do, right? So they give us what's called sympathetic effects. The adrenaline rush tends to prepare your body for stress. So if we were to measure your adrenaline levels like on Tuesday when you're having an exam, they'd probably be elevated, right? And so you're going to see your body respond. Your heart rate's going to be up. You may be sweating a little bit. All that type of thing that prepares you for stress. Pupils may be dilated a bit. Bronchioles in the lungs may be kind of open so you can be breathing a little bit better. Stuff like that. So they are going to be released in a stressful situation. That's what the medulla is going to be doing. It's going to have a sympathetic response. The cortex, on the other hand, releases different hormones. And these are the other two examples that we mentioned of steroid hormones. So aldosterone, see how it has the O on the end, like testosterone, and then cortisol, which is also sometimes called corticosterone. Both of those are steroid hormones. They come from the adrenal cortex, And what they do is each one has a different function. Aldosterone causes sodium retention in the kidneys. So what does retention mean? Keep. Yeah, exactly. So you guys probably know, like this weekend when you're doing all that studying, yeah? Okay. Yeah? I don't know, I'm getting one eyebrow lip and stuff like that. Come on. When you're studying, you may end up like eating a big bag of potato chips, right? You're studying there and you're falling asleep, so you've got some chips there. When I'm grading, I do the same thing. I have Cheez-Its right there going along, right? I saw something, I don't know, so I posted it recently. It was like the correct way to wear a hoodie. And they had it reversed, and they had the hood right here, and they had like all the chips and the Cheetos right there. So you can go right there. It's a nice little chocolate, feed bag like that. So you might want to utilize that this weekend. But the idea there is if you eat a big bag of salty potato chips, you know when you get done, not only do you feel fat because I just ate like a whole box, like 22 servings, but you also feel kind of bloated, right? You eat a lot of salty stuff, you feel bloated. That means you're retaining water. It sets up an osmotic gradient. You pull a lot of sodium in here, and the water follows it, okay? So you're going to hold on to water. So aldosterone causes sodium retention in the kidney. That helps us when we're dehydrated to also hold on to water. So you'll find antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone working together to help you retain water when you're dehydrated, okay? But it's even though the overall effect's the same, the mechanism is different. This is for sodium retention, which then affects water. Okay? Cortisol on the other side of the coin has a different function. It, like growth hormone, like thyroid hormone, etc., has effects on metabolism. It works to increase and maintain metabolism. There's so many cells that respond. Again, we're not going to say it's this cell, that cell, that cell. It's a lot of different cells. Now, sometimes you hear about people actually using cortisone, etc., on a medical level. Now, this is a natural hormone that's released in the body. It affects, like we said, metabolic rate, how fast the cells are doing their activities. But if you take a medical level of cortisone, what it can do is it can act as an anti-inflammatory. Now, generally, the amounts that are going around in your body, they don't have that effect. It's only if you jack it up and actually add some, like in a cream or something like that, where it will have those effects. But anti-inflammatory is pretty important. Why would you want an anti-inflammatory?
Frequent swelling.
Yeah, right? So swelling. So you might have swelling due to what? Right? Allergies, or you hurt yourself or something like that. You twisted your ankle and it's swollen. You got a bee sting or mosquito bite or something like that, poison ivy, swelling, right? If you don't want that to occur, you take a percentage, right? It's usually like maybe 1% or something like that, cortisone solution, put it on there. It kind of causes those blood vessels to shrink, decreases swelling and stuff like that. You can actually get a cortisone shot. You hear about guys in sports, right? Getting a cortisone shot in your joint or something because it decreases swelling for a period of time. Doesn't fix the problem, but you decrease the swelling and now it can move again. There's not as much pain, and so you can go back to it. So that problem is still going to stay there long term. It's only a short-term solution. Okay? But that's another place where you hear about cortisol or cortisone or whatever. Okay. Last one that we hit in terms of endocrine gland is the pancreas. So he said the pancreas is like a feather-shaped organ, sits deep to the stomach. It puts out a few different hormones, and it puts out digestive juices to help us digest things. So it counts both as an endocrine gland and as an exocrine gland. Okay? In terms of endocrine function, it puts out two hormones, glucagon and insulin. And the interesting thing about these, I think it's interesting, is that these are antagonistic to each other. So we have two hormones here that have opposite effects, and they come out of the same organ. So these ones, instead of like calcium, like we were talking about before, these ones are looking to control blood glucose levels. So again, we don't want it to be too high, don't want it to be too low, we want it just right so that the cells have the glucose they need. So insulin decreases blood levels of glucose. Okay? So for instance, after a meal, right? After Halloween, when you're like, you've taken all of your candy from your kids' bags and stuff like that, you've done your taxation on there. You're like, this is mine, you get the Whoppers and stuff. I get all this stuff, right? Then, when you eat all that stuff, your glucose levels spike because your digestive system takes it in, it goes into the blood. We don't want those going too high. So insulin gets released from the pancreas. It has receptors which says, oh, glucose levels are getting too high. We release insulin, and the insulin will cause that glucose to actually be stored as glycogen in the muscles and in the liver mainly. So we store it for later, just like calcium. We're going to need that glucose at some time, but we don't want it just floating around willy-nilly all over the place. So we're going to store it inside of these organs for a time, and then later on, when we need it, glucagon is going to stimulate, like I said, like the liver and the muscles to say, hey, we haven't eaten in a while, our glucose are getting low, I'm getting hypoglycemic, I'm getting dizzy, I can't think and stuff like that. So at that point, glucagon is going to be released by the pancreas. It's going to stimulate the muscle and the liver to release and free up that glucose from the glycogen, and now it's going to bring those glucose levels up again. Okay? So antagonistic effects. It all depends on where it is. We're going to maintain it at a nice set point so that everything, every cell, has enough glucose to do what it has to do. Okay? So those are the two hormones that we're highlighting from the pancreas. And if you look, that's our whole tour of the endocrine system. Okay? So in terms of endocrine system, like we saw, three major things. Talking about the different types, chemical types of hormones and kind of how they work. Talking about how endocrine glands know when to release their hormones. And then it's just a big tour of the different endocrine glands, the hormones they put out, and what those hormones do. Okay? If you're looking at, right, we've got our different lecture quizzes that you're going to be that you've been practicing with. Make sure you're caught up on those. The lab quiz this weekend is on special senses. Make sure that when you're doing that lab quiz, it's about what is that and what does it do. So don't just go, oh, okay, there's a magnetic membrane and leave it blank. You're only getting half the points. So you got to do both structure and function. If you're looking for things like study questions, etc., remember in the first module we've got those exam objectives where it says, special senses, know how to do this, be able to talk about rods and cones and what they do, and what's this rhodopsin molecule, and be able to trace. For instance, a photon of light from the time it enters the eye until it reaches the photoreceptor and then changes into a signal to go to the brain. Likewise for the ear, you can trace a sound wave through each of those different structures, external, middle, and inner ear, all those different structures until it gets translated into what the brain can understand. Okay? So if you're looking to practice and things like that, look at those study questions and see how well you can answer those. Those are oftentimes where I go if I'm doing short answer questions. I'll go there and say, oh, that's a good one. That addresses a major topic. Let's pull that one in, or let's modify that and put that as a test question. Okay? So take a look at those. Do the flashcards, because not only is it helping you study by writing it out, but then you're testing yourself. That's the biggest thing I think people run into, is that they go, oh man, for this class I studied so much, I don't get why I'm not getting an A, right? Well, this class is a bit different than whatever, your English class, etc. So you've got to really see, not only put the time in, but you've got to see how well you're doing. You can't just go, I've studied more, so I should be getting a better grade. That's generally true, but you want to see where you are. If you've studied it up and you're still only getting like half your flashcards right, then you're not there yet. You've got to do some more. You've got to talk about it with somebody, you've got to do those flashcards, read, etc. View the archives from the lecture that are available for you guys, stuff like that. Okay, the Panopto module up on Canvas has a recording of all of our different lectures. So you want to hear what we talk about for how the brain works and stuff, go back and watch those. Okay? All right. So we'll let you out a bit early. Maybe you can get 15 more minutes of studying in before Tuesday. Who knows? All right? So we'll see you then.